So today I'm presenting. Okay. Do I have to do something here? Okay, sorry. Okay, so today I'm presenting joint work with Paul Devereaux and Chel Savanas. For anyone who knows any of my earlier work, that Paul and Chel and I have been working for about 20 years together, and not surprisingly, we're going to be using data from Norway. And we brought on Fanny Landau, who's this great postdoc who was at the Norwegian School of Business, where Chel is. So she does really interesting work on investing in children and education. And so you should be on the lookout for her. And interestingly, this paper came from a talk I gave here. It was at Anderson maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember. I guess about 4 years ago, where I was presenting some work that Paul and I had done with Kaveh Medjlesi and Petter Lundberg on the intergenerational persistence in wealth, trying to get at nature versus nurture by looking at Swedish adoptees. And so someone at the seminar, and I wish I could remember who it was, if it was you, let me know, asked this question, and I presented the paper a reasonable amount of time, so there weren't that many questions that I'd never thought of. And someone said, but isn't wealth endogenous? Isn't, like, once you have kids, that affects how you accumulate wealth, and how are you dealing with that? And I was like, oh, that's a really good question, and we aren't dealing with that. And so I went back and looked at the literature and on intergenerational persistence, and people don't really do anything about that. You just take your wealth at a point in time, it's kind of given. And then I talked to some of the other people, the macro people who do some work on this, and said, you know, who do the intergenerational stuff, and said, how do you guys think about it? And he's like, I talked to Eric Hurst, and he's like, well, we haven't really. And so what we were really interested in when we started this project is how kind of wealth affects kids. But when you start thinking about wealth, it's actually kind of messy. And so this paper is kind of thinking about that messiness. And so just to give a little motivation in case that wasn't sufficient, there's a lot of attention on rising wealth inequality, both in the US and in other countries. So, you know, there's huge discrepancies. And then, as I said, wealth is kind of a weird measure. Like it's the result of actions to increase the flow of money into a household, as well as decisions on how to consume and spend that money. And so individuals could have very similar wealth and very different sources of income, or individuals with the same sources of income could have very different wealth because of differing consumption or spending patterns. And these things might affect our perception of inequality in a society when we look at wealth. And so what we're thinking about with this project is, if you want to understand wealth and wealth inequality, we need to think kind of what we are trying to measure, like what is the inequality that we're trying to think about. And so this paper that I'm going to talk about is a very descriptive paper where we just try to think about, okay, what is it that we would want to measure if we could measure it, and how does that differ from the wealth that we actually measure in our data? And so for those of you who are really into causal identification, you're going to be very sad at the end of this because there is none. And in fact, our methods, as you'll see, are addition. So we're mostly just kind of adding up and correlating things. But I think hopefully at the end, at least if you don't necessarily care or believe our results, you'll be thinking a little bit in the future, like, what do we mean when we're thinking about wealth? Okay, so just to give some extremes as more motivation, and I kind of like this because this is how I think about it. You can imagine one household with very little labor income, but where they get a large inheritance and then they invest their money and then they have a certain amount of wealth at age 65. You have another household that didn't get any inheritance, but worked and saved their money, didn't consume a lot. And so at age 65, they actually have the same wealth. And so if we wanted to look at inequality, would we want to say that was a very equal society? And similarly, as if two people had the exact same income sources and one just spent all their money, and so at age 65 they have very little wealth, the other family or person saved their money and they had a lot of wealth, would we want to say that was a very unequal society? And so this just is kind of motivation to think about what is it that we want to measure when we think about wealth inequality. And so the questions that we're trying to answer in this paper is how does net wealth, which is the wealth that we're usually measuring in data sets when we're looking at inequality or intergenerational persistence, compared to this measure of what we're going to call lifetime resources in the absence of consumption. And so we're going to have kind of a proxy for this, and I'll tell you about that. And so once we calculate, we're going to calculate, we have net wealth in our data. And as I mentioned, this is data from Norway, and I will, of course, talk about how Norway, compares to other countries and how we should think about this. But once we calculate a net wealth and a lifetime resources measure, we can say, how do they compare? Are they highly correlated? Like, are we getting the same thing? We can also kind of decompose this lifetime resources measure and say, well, where are people getting their money? And does this vary over the distribution of either lifetime resources or net wealth? Then what we're going to do, we find that inheritances aren't very important, which is kind of contrary to what a lot of people think. And so this is now kind of a separate paper on, what's going on with gifts and inheritance. So the title, there's actually kind of two papers, but this is like a little baby that has grown from this paper. So you will notice if you read the original Where Does Wealth Come From paper, there's like chunks of it that we have spun off. I don't know what we call that, satellite papers from this original paper. Because people were really skeptical about this gifts and inheritance finding. And so the paper, now there's a separate paper that really goes through and says, okay, let's think about this from all different perspectives and what do we see. So I'll talk about that today. And then the last thing that we do was motivated by, I think, our own interest, which is understanding how wealth affects children and just thinking about if we have had a measure of lifetime resources or we have a measure of net wealth, which is a better predictor of children's outcomes. And this is, again, no causation here, just simply like which one does a better job predicting. And so what we are going to find, I guess I'm telling you what we're doing before I'm telling you what we're finding. What we do is use data from Norway on wealth and income over the life cycle. And so I'm using the word life cycle pretty loosely because we have 19 years of data. So what we would ideally like is starting at age maybe 21, and then we measure all the income that's coming into your household until you die. And that would be your lifetime resources. Unfortunately, we don't have that. So we're going to have 19 years of data. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to miss by that. And so we're going to calculate the capital lifetime resources, which is just what we call it, in 2013, which is just going to be all the inflows into the household between 1995 and 2013, plus your wealth in 1994. And again, I'll go into detail what all these are. And then, as I said, we're going to just look at the correlation between this lifetime resources measure and this net wealth measure, describe the sources of income and how they vary across the wealth distribution, and then provide evidence on which is a better predictor. And then to give you what we find, we're going to find that net wealth is actually a pretty decent proxy for lifetime resources at the extremes of the distribution. So for very wealthy people, they're very highly correlated. For very poor people, they're highly correlated. For people in the middle, much less so. And part of that is, for those of you who know kind of the wealth distribution, there's a big spike at zero, right? A lot of people have close to zero wealth. And so, because they're just consuming all their income. And so for those people, they obviously have lifetime resources because they're living. And so wealth isn't a very good proxy for their lifetime resources. What we show is that people in different parts of the lifetime resources or an actual net wealth distribution, you can kind of look at either, get their income from very different sources. I don't think that's super surprising. For example, you see people at the very bottom of the distribution get a lot more from government transfers. People at the top get it from risky financial assets. We do find that labor income is the most important determinant of lifetime resources, except at the very top. And it's important for everyone, really. It's like a big component. At the very top 1% and 0.1%, we see it becoming much less important, where capital income and capital gains on financial assets become important. And as I said, interestingly, inheritances and gifts are not an important determinant of lifetime resources, even at the very top of the wealth distribution. So that's kind of an interesting finding that a lot of people were surprised and curious about, and I'll tell you why what we find is different from what other people have found. Mostly, it's because we have this really good data. So what a lot of the literature on inheritance has done is looked at things like inheritances over wealth. But wealth really isn't the denominator that you want, right? You want inheritances over all the money that you're getting. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And then the last thing is that lifetime resources is a better predictor of children's outcome than net wealth. So yeah.
What sort of resources do you think might be critical ages for kids, and do those little matter?
So we've tried to do a little bit, because that's kind of exactly where we're going. That was the project that we wanted to start on originally, because and the reason we kind of moved in this direction, in addition to kind of that talk, was one of the things, because I said, oh, well, it'd be interesting just to do a simple OLS regression where you look at wealth at different ages and see which matters, because like Chell has a really nice paper with Pedro Carnero and Emma Tomini, where they look at income at different ages and say, okay, well, which is the most critical age? And I said, well, let's just do an OLS, but you can't really do that with wealth, because if you have two people with the same family income, for example, and one has lower wealth when the kid is 10, it could be because they actually spent their money on their kid at age 5. And so the family with lower wealth, their kid is actually going to do better. So I think that's what motivates us. We're going to, for this, we didn't try that hard, because to identify the timing, because kind of that's where we're going in our own research. So I think that's super interesting. And that was in fact why we were interested in the topic to begin with. Okay. Okay. So to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, I'll spend a little bit of time on related literature, but it's kind of, as you might imagine, like a weird kind of tangentially related to a lot of different literatures, but not sitting exactly in one. I will spend, and in the paper we spend, I think, a lot of time talking about the institutional setting, because as I said, we're talking about Norway. And so it's not a representative country of, well, I mean, it's representative of Norway, and certainly I would say of the Scandinavian countries, it's reasonably representative. But what's interesting is that you see that Norway, in terms of the wealth distribution, actually looks like other European countries. It does not look like the US, for example. So I wouldn't encourage you to necessarily say what we find here is true in the US, but I would love to do this in the US. We can get data on that. The methods are really addition, so that won't take very long. The data, as is with all empirical papers, or most of my empirical papers, the data parts took about 99.9% of the time that we spend on the paper, and it will be one slide or two slides in the talk. So for grad students, that is how it is. And I know when I was a grad student, you want to spend a lot of time talking about your data because it took you so much time to get it there, but nobody else really cares that much about your data as you do. So I will talk about the data and kind of what some of the assumptions that we had to make. But overall, it's really high quality data, so that's good. And then, as I said, I'll talk about the descriptives, so how correlated they are, how measures of inequality would differ if you looked at lifetime resources, look at the components, take the deeper dive in gifts and inheritance, and then do the predictive ability. Okay, so there's a number of literatures that this could relate to. The ones that I think are most closely related are the ones where what they're trying to do is say, okay, how important are inheritances and gifts in the wealth distribution? How important are labor earnings? There's some reason, and so there's some work on this. So Piketty has a number of kind of influential papers on the importance of inheritance and gifts, including his book. Fivison and Sablehouse also use some US data, this survey of consumer finances, which isn't really that good for this, but the US is just not very good in terms of inheritances and gifts because our inheritance taxes is so not binding for so many people. There's some work looking at the importance of labor earnings. They're using the survey of consumer finances as well. And then there's some really nice new papers that have used, a number of them using the Scandinavian data. The Fagereng papers use the Norwegian data, where they look and show that people at different points in the wealth distribution have different savings rates. They're holding different assets. They get different returns. And so kind of trying to explain the wealth distribution by looking at this. And so these are some really nice papers. So what we're doing is kind of just taking a step back and saying, well, let's just look and see like summary statistics of, how important are each of these things when we're putting a common denominator on them. So in some ways, it's really simple. There's also a really interesting macro literature that we have kind of thought about where what they're trying to do is map inputs or inflows into the household into the wealth distribution. So there's a big macro literature trying to explain what the wealth, how we can explain what the wealth distribution looks like. And so trying to map things like inheritances and labor income into these models. And so they're really interesting. We had started, when we started doing this, we were doing something where we just did a really simple regression of net wealth and then each of the components of this lifetime resources just to see like which were more important. And so it was kind of interesting because what you see is that, let's say, inheritances have a really big coefficient, so they're a good predictor of wealth, whereas labor income has a much lower coefficient. And that's really consistent with what the macro people have found, which is, or other researchers have found, which is things like the marginal propensity to consume out of inheritances is much lower than the marginal propensity to consume out of labor, that people just consume a lot of their, wait, did I say that wrong? I think I said the opposite. So people consume a lot of their labor income. They do not consume much of their inheritances. And so, but then we realized that that was like the poor man's macro that we were doing with that regression, and nobody would kind of buy it. And so we've kind of taken a step back. But I think there are some economists at Wharton who are doing something kind of like that, taking this lifetime resources measure and trying to map it into the wealth distribution more directly with a model. But that is not what we're doing.
So in Norway, what's the relationship between the number of kids and wealth?
So it is, I don't know if I actually know that correlation.
Can you get a shape or
I don't know the answer to that. That is a really good question. Sorry. So what we do see is that people with kids have a bigger disparity. Have a bigger disparity between their resources and their wealth. So they do consume more, which I guess is consistent with what, and the more kids you have, the more you're going to consume. But I don't actually know. If I did, I have forgotten. So that's a good question. Okay. Okay, so if in terms of how does Norway compare to other countries? The problem in making these international comparisons is it's hard to find data where you have kind of consistent estimates across countries. So we have kind of two measures. This is the Household Finance and Consumption Survey, which does not survey Norway. So, but it does survey a lot of other countries and asks about things like net wealth It asks about inheritances and other things. And so what we're going to do is use this survey and compare it to our Norway data, which is administrative data. And so they are not the same data sources. So I want to caution that before anything else. Also, the Household Finance and Consumption Survey is a survey. So it is, asking people, it's a, representative sample of the population. Whereas in Norway, we have the whole population. So these are not the same thing. That being said, this is just calculating the household's net wealth in 2014, thousands of euros. The mean, we have the EU, Germany, Italy, Norway, France, and Austria. Looks, Norway looks pretty similar to France, lower than Austria, higher than Germany and Italy. This is the different percentiles of the distribution. If you look at the median, again, Norway looks similar to the other countries. If you look at the extremes of the distribution, you see that Norway looks different, but this is likely because we have the administrative data, so we actually observe the extremes of the distribution. You're much less likely when you have the survey data. And so we thought this was pretty compelling. It wasn't what I thought I was going to see. But Norway actually looks kind of similar to these other countries.
So what's the definition of net wealth? Include everything, houses, vehicles?
Yeah, so this is, I'm trying to think exactly. So the definition of net wealth should include houses. It should include business, like if you own businesses, the value of your businesses, and all financial wealth. I think this does not include pensions. So we don't observe pensions, and I don't think any of these are asking pension wealth in it. And so we matched their definition for this. We also, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So these are, again, using the same data set. Yeah.
But this is just a clarification. I know that when we think about income measurement, we know like when people self-report versus administrative records, we have a pretty good sense of which way that reporting bias goes. What is it for wealth? Should I think about that the same way, or is it different?
I don't know. Because ours is not self-reported. So I mean, I certainly think people understate their wealth in general, but I'm not sure on surveys.
I thought what they found with the survey of consumer finances in the US was that the likelihood of underreporting was increasing, or just not maybe underreporting, but also the non-response rate or the misresponse rate was increasing in wealth. And so that's why the weights were
Okay.
adjusted for that. But I'm talking about
Right.
like the top 10%.
Right. Yeah. So we actually, so yes, I should know that for this. So we do not have self-reported wealth. So we have, yeah. So I'll talk about that. But we have it reported by the financial institutions. They report it directly to Stats Norway. So it's kind of interesting in Norway. Okay, so this is again using that same data set. And so Norway is the red, other countries are the blue. And so the Gini coefficient, again, on net wealth, Norway looks very similar to kind of other countries. The top, the share of wealth held by the top 10% looks kind of similar to other countries. The home ownership rate is similar. This is the median inheritance to gift, median gift or inheritance. So Norway looks similar to France, much less than Italy. So based on these, you might think that Norway looks similar to other European countries. If you look at a different data set, so this is the World Inequality Database. So this is a data set that is purposeful. The goal is to make cross-country comparisons feasible. So it's trying to standardize so that you can make cross-country comparisons. And it should be using kind of national statistics. When you look at things like the net private wealth to secondary income ratio, so let me explain what that is. So that's how much wealth there is relative to income. this is kind of an interesting measure because if you're thinking about something like inheritances, you would expect inheritances to be more important when you have more wealth relative to income. So there's a lot of kind of people holding money relative to the earned income that people are getting. And so you can see when we use this data set, Norway actually looks relatively low, similar to the US, and much lower than like France or Italy.
But that's consistent with the previous one where you showed that the inheritance, the median inheritance was the lowest. If you compare it to Italy, that one, the top right.
Yeah, but it's like France still looks low here and it's high in this other. So France is way up like here for that. So I don't know. I would say that they don't tell like a consistent story necessarily, which I guess is what I'm trying to say. That and if you just look at net private wealth, where this is measured differently and they're including pension wealth, you see that Norway again looks relatively low. We're trying to figure out kind of how they adjusted this because their numbers don't match our numbers, and presumably ours are what is used for the national accounts, and we should match this. But they're doing something to standardize across countries, and we're still kind of trying to figure out what that is. So I guess this is kind of truth in advertising. Like it seems like Norway could be similar to other countries, but you know, you should kind of take that with some caution.
Is the other survey less good at dealing with debt since it's tracking those, or
Less dealing with what?
deaths?
Deaths.
Deaths.
Oh, debt. So why would they be less? Good at
So I don't know
debt?
if we're just when people are reporting this stuff, but if you go back, you had sort of negative numbers for people down. For people in your data, but you didn't have those negative numbers.
Oh. Yeah, that may be true. Yeah. It seems kind of symmetric though, because we have the really high numbers too that they don't have, because our means actually look. But yeah, it could be that. Okay, so just to give you a little more context about Norway, and so yeah, so those other figures are just really to give you some context, and I kind of leave it to you to determine. We think it seems, you know, not like an extreme outlier in our mind, and so we think there's still a lot we can learn from it. Norway does have a wealth tax, and that's why we have really good wealth data. So there's an exemption level, and then the tax is about 1% during our sample period. The threshold was about 1.5 million for a married couple of Norwegian kroner. It's about 7 to 8 on average kroner per dollar. So I just divide by 10, which is, and then add some to get a sense of what it is. But you have to, it's reported for all wealth levels. So it's not that you only report if it's, you know, above the threshold. And as I'll talk more about it, but this is actually reported by the financial institution. So it's not a self-report of your own wealth. There is an inheritance and gift tax. So you're kind of required to report inheritances and gifts. That ended in 2014, which is why we stopped in 2013. We can actually do, from kind of looking at the data, you can do a pretty good job of figuring out inheritances, because you can see when your second parent dies, and then you see the change, you know, the inheritance that you get in the sample period is pretty much equal to the parents' wealth when they die divided by the number of kids. So we could go later because we have more wealth data, but we haven't because people were really worried about measurement error in our inheritances, so we stopped there. The inheritance tax ranges from 0 to 20% for children of the deceased, and is slightly higher if it's not a child. And so the way the gift tax works is that it is cumulated over time. So even if you're below the threshold, when you give a gift, they keep track of it so that ultimately you'll be taxed on it. And surprisingly, people really do report gifts. So I'm sure not all gifts are reported. Like, you know, my mom takes me out to dinner and it's not reported. But it does seem like a lot of people are reporting this. The tax is relatively low, and there's, you know, so people seem to be pretty compliant.
What's
Yeah.
the exemption threshold for the inheritance and gift tax?
It is. Glad to have my PowerPoint. So it changed over time. And so you can see this is in Norwegian kroner. So it's pretty low, like it's like a pretty low threshold. So 100,000 kroner.
Does that mean that you don't observe inheritance below 100,000?
No, we do. We observe anything above 5,000 kroner.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So it's reported even if it's below the threshold. So yeah, so that's good. That would be a problem if it weren't. And what we see is about 45% of all gifts and inheritances are coming from gifts. So they are really reported.
So a lot of inheritance is going to be probably property.
Yeah.
But how's the property actually valued?
So the way they do it is for when assets are, when they have an outside evaluator come and evaluate the evaluate the value.
Okay, so it's not a constructed.
No, it's not. So it's, yeah, they're pretty good about getting the full value of what it is. Okay. Norway has a very compressed income distribution and a strong welfare state. So this is, I think, important to think about. Certainly, you know, if you were trying to compare it with the US or other similar countries, health insurance is provided, education is free, you don't have to save for your kids' college. So there's a lot of things that are different that you don't need to necessarily save for in Norway. And also retirement is almost entirely pension. So you get a state pension from the government. You also have occupational pensions. And they don't really, very little income comes from like a 401k type of thing. So it's really kind of defined benefit pensions. Unfortunately, we don't observe your pension income, so we can't see that, but it's generally not calculated in net wealth anyway. Like we don't generally value that when we do wealth calculations. And then there's kind of little fun fact is that wealth and income tax returns are publicly available, so you can actually see what your neighbors are earning, which Chell says keeps you honest. I wasn't sure about that, but yeah. Okay, so the methods that we're using are addition. So a nice simple paper. And so basically what we're going to do, this is the definition of net wealth in any one year, is your net wealth in the year before that, plus all the money that came into your household. So earnings, net capital income, net government transfers, inheritance and gifts, lottery wins, the appreciation of real assets, the appreciation of financial assets, plus the taxes you pay. So we've taken them out here and we take out the wealth tax, less your consumption. Okay, that's just the definition of net wealth. So you can rewrite that net wealth at a point in time is your net wealth at the beginning of a period, plus all the inflows over that time period, less the wealth tax, less consumption. And our lifetime resources measure is basically just taking that out. And so it is the net wealth in 1994, plus all the inflow coming into the household over that time period. So the nice thing about this is that we can calculate it, it's easy. Ideally, you wouldn't have this net wealth in 1994, you would have the income coming from other sources in the previous period. This is kind of the limitation of only having 19 years of data. And so this is really just kind of an accounting exercise. It's just saying, okay, where is the income coming from? It is not actually what your counterfactual lifetime resources would be if you did not consume. Because if I did not consume, I would have taken that money and invested it somewhere and gotten some returns on that, right? And so we're not missing the actual money you consumed, because that's coming in here. We are missing the returns that you would have earned had you not consumed it. And so that's where this, we call that slippage. That's kind of a nice way of saying kind of an imperfect measure. We also, to kind of get around this, measure what we call total inflows, which is basically taking only the primary sources, right? Because one thing that's kind of weird about this is if I get labor income and then I invest it, it's going to become like the returns on that are going to become capital income, for example, or return on financial assets. And so if you care about like the importance of inheritance, let's say you're going to, you could say, oh, well, but inheritance is going to become something else. And so you're going to be understating it. So as kind of another measure, what we do is we take only the primary sources, how we define primary sources, which are labor income, government transfers, and inheritance and gifts. And we say, let's look at only those sources. And then when you get it, we're going to give you a rate of return on it and kind of grow it up. And so we're not letting you kind of make different investment decisions or anything like that. We're just going to say, okay, you're going to get the rate of return that people in your wealth group got in that year over each year, and give you kind of compounded return on that. And so that has the advantage where we're going to truly get like the importance of inheritance relative to kind of these other sources of income. And that's what the inheritance paper is really focusing on. The downside is you might care about these other components like, oh, well, how much of your income is coming from financial assets? And you're not going to get any of that from that. So we do things kind of both ways. And interestingly, inheritance and gifts, even when you're kind of blowing up inheritances, are still really small, as you will see.
Right, I think
Yeah.
this. Why is it that, so net capital income should just be the return on your assets, both financial and non-financial, right? Or
So
what
this is just the definition, is a definitional thing. So this is just the return on like bonds or
Right.
interest rates. This is the return on your like housing. So we just have separated them
okay.
into different
Okay.
components. Yeah,
But
this is
they're both returns.
they're both returns.
It's just
Yeah,
one is on financials and the other one's on not.
exactly. And so
Gotcha.
this is like dividends.
Yeah.
And this is like stock returns that may be unrealized. Like you don't need to sell the stock, for example, to get the return on it.
I see.
Yeah.
So if I buy a house,
Yeah.
where does it show up?
So it would show up in, you would have, well, when you buy a house, it's not going to change it. That, right, that transaction doesn't change your wealth. But it would, you would have real assets, but you would also have debt. So this is kind of, so you would have assets and debt. This would, so it wouldn't change your wealth originally, right? Because you're holding it in a different form. The next year, you would have appreciation on your house if you grew in value, and this would have the interest you pay. So this would have a negative for the interest you pay on the debt. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But if you just change one form to another, it's not going to change your wealth, but the returns will change. So, okay. So that's the complicated part of the paper. It is very weird to present a really descriptive paper when you're used to kind of presenting more causal kind of stuff.
So some of
Yeah.
those measures are endogenous in the sense that people make choices of how to say.
Absolutely.
And that's not important in the sense that some may be lucky, they invest in the stock market.
Exactly. So yeah. So that is to some extent, this is just purely descriptive. It is not like we're not saying. It's just saying where are they getting their money from. It could be that they're very good. It could be that they have more knowledge. It could be
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
lucky. It could be any of those things. We're not kind of saying anything about where it's coming, kind of why they're behaving differently. We're just saying this is the kind of where they're getting their money from. And some of the other work has kind of tried, for example, the work looking at the Foggering et al. Paper looking at their return to assets, financial assets, is trying to disentangle kind of what is it about, why are they getting different returns? Like, are they, because they're actually, what they find is that it's not just that they're investing differently, even within the same type of asset, like class of assets, they're getting higher returns. And so it could be that they're lucky, it could be that they have more information, you know, it could be lots of things. But this is just really just an accounting exercise. So, you know, a lot of this is, you know, is based on decisions, right, that people make on how to do it.
Business income would be part of earnings.
So business income, depending on how it's reported, could be if you own like actual the structure would be on real assets. If you own a share of a business, it would be under the financial assets that way. Okay, and so here's the data section. So it is really good data. We start with the population register. So the cool thing is it's like the whole population of Norway. And we can see like whose parents, whose siblings, so we can see kind of family connections, which I think is pretty cool. We're focusing on people who lived in Norway every year between 1994 and 2013, because we need to kind of see you every year. We're able to match the population register to the wealth register and the income register, so we can see wealth holdings in the wealth register, and this is because they have the wealth tax, so that's kind of a good thing for us. What's really interesting is that it's reported by financial institutions, so the banks and other financial institutions are reporting the values, and so in Norway, you actually get an email saying your taxes are done, and you can look at it, and then you can kind of try to contest it if you want to change it or something, but they kind of pre-do your taxes and then send it to you, and you have to kind of go from there, which seems very efficient. Then, so it's reported by financial institutions, and again, they're not censoring, so you're getting kind of everyone, even if they have very little. All financial assets held outside retirement accounts are reported, including bank accounts, bond, mutual funds, and stocks. The administrative data on inheritances and gifts is available between 1995 and 2013. And so because it's reported by the financial institutions, it's just really much higher quality than self-reported data. As I said, it's a balanced panel of adults born between 1948 and 1973. So we're focusing on people who were between 21 and 46 in 1994 and who aged to be 40 to 65 in 2013. It doesn't make sense to look much before 21. If you look, people don't have a lot of income or assets before then. It's also hard to think about, well, what is a gift? Like when kids are in a household, you know, they're not, you know, you pay for their dance lessons, that's not a recorded gift that you're giving them. And so we also do, you know, robustness checks where we look, because we can look much older. But again, because we only have a 19-year panel, looking at someone age 85 isn't super interesting because you're only looking at them from age 66 to 85, and they're not really accumulating a lot of wealth then. So, but we can look at people over kind of any 19-year period. The thing that you have to remember is that we really have a cross section. Like it seems like we do have a panel, but what we're going to do is for each person, we're following you over that 19-year period so that in 2013, you have a measure of lifetime resources and a measure of net wealth. So even though like we would love to follow people as they age and look at their lifetime resources over time, we aren't really doing that. And so what we can do is look at different people of different ages and kind of try to infer from that, but we again, it's really, think of it like we have a cross section in 2013 where we have your lifetime resources and we have your net wealth.
I actually had a question about the family side. So I was really curious with the lifetime resources, if it captures like cash transfers between like families, like, you know, if I wanted a loan from my brother, like, is that to start a business or because I'm behind on payments? Like, is that capture? Does that like make an impact?
So if you gave your brother money,
Or
that
like,
would
if
be-
if he gave me money, but I'm not like reporting that because it's like between families. I guess it's kind of more of a, I guess, a whole ticket type.
yeah, so I don't know if, so I honestly, I don't know about like brother sister gifts, but if from parent child, you would be required, and I assume this is probably similar brother sister, but I haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
You would be, if I gave you the money to pay for your house or something, then that would be counted as a gift. And you would be required to report it. And because they can kind of see what you're doing with your money, if like they would know that you bought a house, and if it now has your child's name on it, that would
Okay,
be.
maybe that was like
you
a
know.
bad example. I think I was just thinking of like resource sharing, like in general, but.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's probably a gray area where it's like, well, I mean, you know, if I loaned you money and then you pay me back, you know, you might not count that. It depends on what you would report. But I think anytime you give someone money, you are required to report it.
This would only affect the top part of the distribution, but what about money which is in foreign countries?
So technically you are required to report those. And so I think, and there is kind of good research by Gabriel Zuckman on this that shows that it is at the very top of the distribution. His research actually looking at a holiday or whatever where they gave immunity in Norway shows that most of it was coming from the top like 400 people, wealthiest people. So they are in our sample, and so we could like, you know, we are going to be underreporting for them. But I think, and most people aren't holding foreign assets like in foreign countries. So I think it isn't really a big issue for us, and maybe at the top. There is going to be measurement error. So as good as like, you know, I was talking to Wojciech, who's a colleague of mine who has used this data, and like, you know, I was saying, well, but like the housing data, the measure of housing isn't great. We're gonna, you know, people are reporting, you know, self-employment. Sometimes they're reporting if you have a very small business. If you have a big business and you're self-employed, then they'll audit it, but they audit it over a certain amount of sales. But otherwise, like if you're small, you can probably underreport that. And he kind of reminded me, well, this is kind of the best that's out there. It's not perfect. So I think, you know, there is going to be underreporting, and people have an incentive to do it. Norwegians are pretty honest according to kind of the research. So I think it's probably less than in other countries. But I think it's as good as you're going to get for this kind of thing. The last thing that we do is kind of an arbitrary decision, and so but our conclusions aren't sensitive to this. It's interesting because when you think about wealth, you think kind of at the household level, right? Like a household has a certain amount of wealth and it's shared between spouses often. And so, but the problem is when you're trying to add it over 19 years, like households are forming, households are dissolving.
Sorry.
I thought we were going to have to evacuate. Yes. So in terms of how to deal with that, it seemed like the way you want it is when you're in a household, you share the wealth, but or you share the income. When you're not, you know, with a partner, you don't share the income. And so that's exactly what we did. So we call it individual household wealth, and it's basically taking, if it's a couple, we take the total income coming into that household and divide it by 2. So my income from labor, for example, in any year would be the sum of mine and my husband's, and then divided by 2 if we're together. Once we split up, if we did split up, hypothetically, we didn't, but it would just be my income for me after that. And so one of the things that we're going to look at is kind of what happens after this. And actually, Luigi Pistafari has a new paper on this, looking at kind of a sort of matching overall, which
And
I
then
think is
when
interesting.
you tell us that, wait, so you talk, at some point you're gonna rank households.
Mhm.
Are you gonna use the measure in 2013 or the baseline in 1994?
Mostly 2013. Yeah, mostly 2013. We actually use parents' wealth in 1994, though, sometimes. Okay, and so these are the components of our lifetime resources. So it's net labor income, which is employment and self-employment, less taxes. Transfer income is government transfers. Inheritance and gifts, I mentioned, and here were the cutoffs. So we see everything above 5,000 kroner between 1995 and 2009, and then above 30,000 kroner after 2009. Capital income is just interest from bank deposits, dividends you get from stocks, rent from property, and then we impute rental income because if you buy a house, that's actually, and you're living in it, it's consumption, and so we're going to try to take that out. So here are kind of the messy parts. So just to be honest, the real assets and risky financial assets are our messiest measures. And there's a lot of research. Again, Fongering has a number of papers, and Magnum Ostead looking at kind of how good the housing data is, and it's not great. But we tried a whole bunch of different adjustments, and our conclusions don't change, which is, as you'll see, housing is kind of really important for the middle of the distribution, and then less important at the tails. The way to get the return on your housing, because we can't observe the sale price kind of every year, is what we do is we take the value of your house at a point in time, and then we give you that year the return on houses in that region of residence for that year. So we're giving you kind of the return that people got, or the sales that the increase in prices that people got in that year in that region. So that's not perfect, but
Are you defining those regions in the same way that the Norwegians do it to impute the values for the wealth tax? Because after
Yes.
2010, that's what they do, right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So we're using their same regions.
How
Yeah.
big are these regions, just for those of us not?
That's a good question.
They're like counties, states.
I think of them like counties, but I'm not sure. Do you happen to know?
Yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah.
I thought it was-
Yeah. Sorry.
They're sufficiently large so that there's variation within the unit.
But they're not like two.
No,
It's
it's
like-
more than,
Yeah.
yeah. I was gonna say like 18.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we spend a lot of time in our own work kind of using different housing values, because you have the data get much better in 2010. And so before 2010, we have worse data, and so we make kind of a bunch of different assumptions. Similarly, there really isn't a lot of good data on housing prices, and that's just a limitation. There is good data on stocks and what you have in your portfolio, but we have not got that yet. So we were supposed to get that. So right now we can observe how much money you have in risky financial assets, and we can observe how much of it is in listed and unlisted shares. And so what we do is we give you the return, since we can't observe the actual. If we could observe your actual stocks, we could calculate what your actual return was. What we're going to do in the meantime is give you the return to the stock market index in Norway. And so the only variation is coming from how your portfolio is allocated between kind of risky financial assets, housing assets, and capital income, because we're giving everyone kind of that same return for risky financial assets. So that's a limitation of what we're doing too. We also have lottery wins, which we don't even appear on our graphs, I think, because they're so small as a fraction. We have the wealth tax, and then we have net wealth measures in 94 and 2013. Okay, so here's what the distribution of net wealth and lifetime resources looks like. So the purple is the net wealth distribution. And you can see this is around kind of close to zero. So people don't have really zero net wealth, but they have very, kind of close to zero. And this is trimmed because in our data work, we don't have to trim, but for figures, you won't see things because there are some really big tails there. So we're trimming the top 1% and bottom 0.1% of both of the distributions. And so you can see, not surprisingly, that lifetime resources is to the right, and net wealth is much more to the left. Okay, when we look at how correlated are these, we first look at, this is just the correlation between lifetime resources and your net wealth. And again, both of these are now measured in 2013. What we see is they seem pretty highly correlated. Here, the correlation is 0.77. That correlation is somewhat sensitive to how much you Winsorize, so how you deal with the top and the bottom of the distribution, not surprising. So if you don't Winsorize at all, like the correlation gets higher. So because these people up here, they just don't consume very much. And you imagine like a lot of their consumption is actually investing in housing, for example, you have a huge house. And so they're very highly correlated. Down here, it's kind of less so. When we look at the rank correlation, you can kind of see what's going on here. They're highly correlated kind of at the bottom, and at the very top, they become much more correlated, and then they're a lot flatter here. And so the rank correlation is about 0.64. Yeah.
In the previous graph, do you know the else growth? Just out of curiosity.
So, no, I can't think of it. I feel like I should be able to calculate it, but I'm not, I'm not going to do it right now. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, oh, way back.
Are lifetime resources always greater than net wealth? So the difference between these two is like how much bigger is your lifetime resources?
Yeah, so it should, yeah, I mean, I think it could probably happen because we don't have the perfect measures, but it should be the lifetime resources is bigger because we are only taking out kind of the negative parts in theory. Okay. Okay. And so they seem pretty highly correlated. If you look at inequality measures, I'm going to show this one first just because I like it. I like these rainbow colors. I find them very attractive.
Yeah.
But what this is kind of just another way of showing what I just showed you. This is different deciles, not really percentiles of lifetime resources distribution. So we break them into 20 ventiles, and then 80 to 90, 90 to 99, 99 to 99.99, and then the top 0.1%, because we observe people at the very top. And this just tells you these are where they are in the lifetime resources distribution. And this is where they are in the net wealth distribution. So this big chunk here says that most of the people, over 50% of the people who are in the bottom of the lifetime resources distribution are also in the bottom of the net wealth distribution. When we look at the top 0.1%, we see most of them are in the top 0.1% of the net wealth distribution. And then you can see it kind of, gets a little blurrier in the middle. And so just to say, I kind of motivated this with, well, inequality measures, might be sensitive depending on what you're measuring. And in fact, that is the case. So you will get, the Gini coefficient for net wealth is 0.59. Just to give you for comparison, I think it's been measured at 0.78 in the US. While it's 0.27 for lifetime resources, the share of resources held by the top 1% is 0.17 for net wealth, 0.07 for lifetime resources, and this is just giving you for lifetime income. And then the other thing is, so people have brought up, well, but people have to live. And so lifetime resources isn't really taking account of the fact that people have to live, like there's a basic level of consumption that they have to have. So as an arbitrary decision, we just said, okay, let's take out the poverty line for each family or each household here, so that we're letting everyone have the same very low consumption. And then you can see that that is going to affect kind of our Gini coefficient. And so we're kind of saying, okay, well, lifetime resources is kind of less concentrated than net wealth. And the measure of inequality is going to be sensitive to whether you use lifetime resources or net wealth.
Have you looked at this based on age?
Yes. So we do, and I'm trying to think what, I can't remember what we found. We
You would
did do.
expect this to be quite different. For young people, maybe the correlation is not as high.
So we looked at, I can't remember, I don't think we did the Gini things, but the correlations we did, and they're in the paper, and now I can't remember what they are, but I think they're less correlated when you're younger and much more correlated when you're older. So
Is the difference really big
I-
to change the message of the paper?
I think it was, it's in the paper and I'm not remembering. I don't think it changed. It went up to a high of like 0.81 for older, and I think it was like 0.58 or somewhere around there for younger people. So they're still correlated, like they're still highly correlated. Yeah. So, and I don't even know, we're not 100% in agreement on what our message is, even just looking at this, like, is it a good proxy? Well, it really is at the top, and I think it's pretty good at the bottom, and I'm like, in the middle, it's kind of less good. So, so if you look at the correlations kind of in here, I think they, depending on how you break it, it's like 0.5 or so. So I don't know if you would say that was high or not. I guess it depends on what you're doing. Yeah, but it does vary by age. Okay, so the next thing that we do, which is really straightforward, is just say, okay, where is your money coming from? And so we break it again by these different groupings of the lifetime resources distribution. So again, this is in 2013. And we just say where's, as a share, what are the different income sources? So again, even though it always adds up to 1, obviously the amount here is much, much higher than the amount here. But what's interesting, so here is, oh no, this is the wrong, this is the one I showed you. Here, this adds up to 1. So here they have negative, and so we have a little positive. And again, this is by bin of the lifetime resources distribution. And so what you can see is this purple is labor income. So most of people are getting most of their money from labor income. It's just at the top. So this is the top 1%. So 99 to 99.9, and this is the top 0.1%. They're getting much less from labor income. This blue is government transfers. So you can see the people at the bottom are getting more government transfers, and that goes down. This yellow, is it yellow? Yellow is capital. Capital gains on real assets, so that's housing. So think of that as housing. So that's kind of big for people in the middle. This is gains on risky financial assets. So that's really important at the top, but not important for most people. And then the kind of interesting thing, so this is net capital income, this kind of attractive periwinkle, I guess. And then what's really interesting is this little green is inheritances and gifts. And so this is throughout the whole distribution. So it's even at the very top, you see very small share coming from inheritance and gifts. And so this is, people were really surprised by this. And so that's how it kind of became another paper taking a deeper dive on this. When we break it by decile of net wealth, so you wouldn't really, in general, be able to break your data by decile of lifetime resources, since you don't normally observe it, but you could break it by decile of net wealth. And the patterns look very similar. So it seems like in this case, it's kind of a reasonable approximation for what's going on underneath.
Andy, can I
Yeah.
just ask a question? I think, just so that I understand, so if I buy assets for my kids, like so they're stocks or something,
Right.
they get returns, that belongs to them, that does not show up as a gift.
If
Like
you
every-
bought it for them, that
Every
would become
year,
their asset.
I give them like a stock for the birthday or something along those
So the
lines.
stock transfer would be,
If I have a stock and I give it to them, that shows up, but if I
Yeah.
buy them stock or something
well, that would show up as their asset.
after
you
they-
bought it
after
in their
they're
name.
21, but if they're kids, like, I'm just wondering about how some of the age dynamics work here.
So here, you mean in life in general or in
Well,
our
just in
sample?
sort of- well, maybe I want to go, I'm just thinking more about maybe the paper you want to tell us more about, the baby paper later about that small share of lifetime wealth that's part of that inheritance.
So if I bought you a stock, even if you're like 10 years old, if the stock is in your name, it is your wealth.
It's your wealth.
It's your wealth, and you would get the return on
Got
it. And so the kids, we can observe like kids'
Okay.
wealth. We just
Okay.
weren't sure, like,
Yeah.
we did something originally starting at 0 and kind of growing it over time and seeing what was going on. The problem is, like, if you buy someone a stock, like, that's gonna be in there, and that's kind of an easy one.
Mm.
If, like, I took you on a trip, we went on vacation
Right,
together, like, it's a transfer, but
Right.
I took you on vacation and it's not
Right.
gonna be. And so that's gonna be a problem kind of at any age, but it's more of a problem when you're still living with your parents. So, like, it's hard to know what a gift is. And your example is actually one of the few that would be easy because you put it in the kid's name,
Right.
right? And so, but certainly if you bought a stock and then gave them the returns to go buy candy or whatever,
Right.
that would not appear in here. And so,
Okay.
yeah, so it's messy kind of going much earlier, which is why we didn't go any earlier. Okay, but it's a good question, and it is kind of part of the bigger thing that we're interested in. So, okay, so then we can look by age. And again, remember that this is what I'm going to show you is different ages. It's not the same people. So it's just each person at someone who's 45, they're 19 years before, someone who's 50, they're 19 years before. And so we can look at net labor income. And so the way to read this is for age, okay? And so again, these are different people. It's, we're not following people. It's in 2013. This is the labor income over lifetime resources share. So how much of your total lifetime resources is coming from labor income? And then we break it by these different groupings of the lifetime resources distribution. So it's a little bit messy, but it's a kind of a good way of seeing at different ages where are they getting their resources from. And you can see this is the very top. This is the top 0.1%. They're not getting much from their lifetime resources. Most people are getting a lot from their lifetime resources. It's declining over age because they're getting more from returns on assets. And also, as you get closer to retirement, we'll see like government transfers are kind of going up as you get pensions, which will be counted as government transfers. When we look at capital gains on risky financial assets, we see that for most people, they don't get anything over their lifetime. It's just not part of where they're getting their money from. And it's only at the very top where this is important. And then when we look at gifts and inheritances, we see inheritance and gifts are maybe more important at the top of the distribution early on. And then, and for some people, most people, it kind of they become more important here because that's when you're getting your gifts and inheritance. Like most people, parents luckily are not dying until you're older. So most of this money is being transferred around in your 50s. So a lot of people, you get some gifts from your parents when you're younger, but relatively speaking, it's happening later, except for people at the very top of the distribution. And even for them, it's a really small share. This is, I think, is kind of interesting. So here is, okay, so here's as a fraction of total inflows. So here we're only letting there be like 3 components, and we're growing them up. So if you were worried that we were underestimating in the early figure, what you can see here is that for younger people, relative to total inflows, so relative to labor income, at the very top of the distribution, they're getting a lot more from gifts and inheritance, so almost up to 0.2, but this is still actually a relatively small number compared to what, you know, the inheritances to wealth that other people have found. And then you can see that for most people, this is just a really small amount. So
Presumably the red are just gifts, not really inheritance, right?
yeah,
More
so a lot of
valuable
these are
gifts,
gifts, yeah. And then if, just to go
So if
back.
anything, mortality rates are decreasing as well, right?
Right, exactly. So here we look at, this is just a slightly different version, not actually addressing anything, bring up, but another thing you could be thinking about is maybe people aren't dying enough. That sounds bad, but so what happens if we only look at the people whose second parent died in this time period? So that means they're kind of eligible for an inheritance. And so, because inheritances, there's no, in France, you actually get an inheritance when the spouse dies, but in Norway, that is not the case. So your parents have to die or someone else. And you can see that maybe this green is like a little bit bigger, but it's still really small. So no matter kind of how we cut it, we don't find that inheritances are very important. And I'll come back to this.
Do inheritances skip a generation at all? Do they go to grandkids?
So we looked at that before, because that was kind of some of our variation that we were looking at in the original project that we're going back to. And I think we didn't find very much of that, but I can't remember the numbers. If I don't write it down right now, I won't remember. So, okay. So then in this now new paper called the quote unimportance of inheritance, where un is in parentheses, we kind of take a deeper dive into this inheritance thing because people were really kind of skeptical. So we presented this, Fanny presented this to Law Piketty, and he's like, oh, you're not measuring inheritance as well, and you have all these problems with your data. And so we have now gone and written a whole paper about why our data are good, which is kind of what we should call the paper. And so what we're doing there, because we didn't want this problem of the fact that we may be understating the importance of inheritance by letting you invest it, we're only looking at the total inflows measure. So we're not going to break it down, and we're only letting you have labor income, government income, and inheritance or gifts. And so here we're going to look at this ratio of capitalized gifts and inheritances to total inflows, which is, I kind of already showed you that graph. And we motivate it more with kind of the existing literature on specifically inheritances. Basically, there were 2 strands of this literature. One that's kind of looking at aggregate statistics. So they tried, so Piketty and others have tried to do recently kind of the idea of looking at inheritances to relative to like total income or some similar measure. And they find reasonably high numbers. The problem is it's just really hard to get good data on this. And so, so our contribution is that we actually have this really good data, and we can explore kind of heterogeneity throughout the distribution, which these aggregate statistics can't do. And this builds on like an earlier literature that was a big debate by Kotlikoff and Summers and Modigliani, where they argue kind of whether you should capitalize things, and you can find really different importance, but they're putting it over wealth, which again is this weird idea of saying, oh, I got inheritance of $30,000 and now my wealth is $100,000, and so the fraction of my inheritance to wealth is whatever, 30 over 100. The problem with that is people can actually have negative, if like you can have very small numbers if your wealth is lower than your if your wealth is much lower than your inheritance. So you can have really big numbers that don't make sense. There's also been some micro approaches where they're using micro data, and the limitation is they tend to be putting that over wealth. And so that kind of, we're treating all income symmetrically by using total inflows as our denominator. And so what?
So that's a waste. Is it using wealth as a denominator or such a bad thing? Seems okay. So
it's just if you, it depends. So it's not like, it's just kind of a weird thing to do, right? Because you've spent and consumed and like, so you're not treating, so if I looked at income over wealth, that would look much bigger too, right? Everything's going to look bigger because I've consumed to get to wealth.
That's that, but inheritance is one in a lifetime, so you can think of that as adding to the stock. So maybe
Unless you're consumed, so,
no,
so
I
yeah.
understand your point. That you understand this total lifetime measure of
Right.
resources. I don't see why it's such a bad measure. What they are doing.
I mean, I think it's bad because it depends on why your wealth is low, for example, if it's because you had no money or because you consumed a lot,
Yeah,
right?
well,
So that's kind of the motivation of what we're doing is like, oh, it matters which of those it is. Like the number, you could get the same number, but for very different reasons. One is because I have no other income, and the other is I got a lot of income, but I also consumed a lot. And so the conclusion might be different from that. Oh, yeah.
Because of curiosity, if you look in your data and you do the inheritance over wealth,
Mm-hmm.
how does that look like?
So that's a really good question. And in this paper, we do something. The problem is that they tend to look at wealth at death and inheritance. And because we only observe 19 years, like we might not observe the inheritance that you got, because we can only see, because most of our sample isn't dying in our time period. And so.
But you can see in your cross section like how many inheritance are people getting in 65 to death.
So what we've done is we've done something kind of similar where we do, I don't think I have a graph of it, but in the paper, what we do is this economic flows argument where you kind of take mortality rates, the ratio of gifts to inheritances, and kind of use these four kind of aggregate measures to get this economic flows of inheritance. And when we do that, we get very similar to what, so France actually looks like more of an outlier, but we get similar to UK and Germany. So our economic flows look consistent with what other people have found in terms of the importance of inheritance, even though their papers would argue that inheritances are more, it looks like inheritances are more important than when you do it this way, because they're making kind of pretty big assumptions to get these aggregate statistics. Yeah.
Oh, just want to let you know it's 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
You have it in afterwards.
Oh, okay. No, I knew I'm good. We're good. We're almost done. Okay. And so we find that, so we kind of motivate by saying, well, there is a lot of inequality in the receipt of inheritances. So if you look at just who's getting inheritances in I was going to say dollars, but in kroner, you can see this is where you are in the distribution of parental wealth. So the people whose parents are super wealthy are getting most of the inheritances. This is super surprising, and people whose parents are not wealthy, and this includes the zeros. So in terms of the average amounts of capitalized inheritances. So you can see that it's really unequally distributed, which is what research has shown. But we still find that in gifts and inheritances are on average a small fraction of the total inflows. This is the graph, the figure I showed you before. When we look at break the sample, and so this is what the inheritance paper does, is really break the sample by different numbers, like the top 1%. We break it by total inflows, I showed you. We break it by net wealth, and then we break it by labor income. So the people with the highest labor income, the people with the highest net wealth, and the people with the highest total inflows. And it's just never really important, even at the top of the distribution. And so I think the net wealth is kind of interesting, because that's what I think people are thinking about, that these people who are the wealthiest in 2013 are not getting, on average, their income from gifts and inheritances. There is one group for whom gifts and inheritances are very important. This is the people whose parents are very wealthy. And so if your parents are the wealthiest parents in 1994, what we see is you are more likely, you get a lot more of your income from gifts and inheritances. So the interesting thing is those people are not just the same people who are the wealthiest in the country. And so that's kind of the interesting distinction. If your parents are very wealthy, then you're likely to get, and very wealthy meaning the top 0.1%, you're likely to get a lot of your money from inheritances, but that isn't the same group of people who are the wealthiest people. And so that's kind of our finding. And so as a result, gifts and inheritances, if you tried to equalize them or got rid of them, it's not going to do much if you think about this measure of inequality.
But the last part is endogenous, in a sense that if I have very wealthy parents, probably I don't work, I wait, so that could contribute to inequality.
So but we don't see, so maybe this isn't, but when we look at labor income, we don't see that they're not working. We see that it's pretty evenly distributed across the labor income.
I can work as
Yeah.
a teacher.
No, I agree. I I totally think that's true. And there's a really nice paper by, I can't remember her last name is Boar, B-O-A-R, I think she's at NYU. She has this really cool paper and she has a co-author, so I apologize. So I guess she's a junior woman, so good for her. And I'm remembering her name. She has this really cool paper where they're looking at like how occupation choice depends on your parents' wealth, and like that I choose an occupation when my parents have a lot of wealth, that my occupation choice is different. So yeah, so this is definitely like inheritance is affecting lots of your expectations for inheritance is affecting a lot of things. So I'm not trying to say that this is like some causal thing, and so maybe you're right, this is too strong. But I do think it's kind of interesting that the net wealth, like it isn't the same people who are the wealthiest, and I think that's kind of what the perception is. Yeah.
Do you know how this measure of gifts and inheritances might treat something like a life insurance policy, like in the event that someone dies before they're, I guess, expected to die or something, like how that might factor into these measures?
So it should be that it should include life inheritance measures, like it should include life inheritance, but I don't know how it treats it. Apparently it's very small in Norway, so they don't, it's like, we asked about this, like, and it's a very small fraction of people have life insurance. Okay, so the last thing in the last few minutes, which is probably good because this is pretty speculative and a little embarrassing, it's just where we thought, okay, well, let's see which is a better predictor of children's outcomes, because that's kind of what motivated us. But Again, like this is not at all causal. We took some outcomes like this is your middle school grade point average, an indicator whether you enrolled in the high school track, whether you enrolled in college in your completed years of education. This is measured when people were 20, so it's measured in 2019. And so they were 20 to 22 in 2013. So we were trying to figure out, we wanted the ages when our 19 years were going to be important, if that makes any sense. Like, because remember, we're going to have your parents' total resources up to for over a 19-year period. And so we want that to kind of reflect what the resources were when you were growing up. And so that's how we picked this kind of age group in 2013. So they're measured when they were 16 to 22 in 2013, and this was measured when they were 20 to 22 in 2013. And so what we see is this is just the R squared, where we put in your rank in the distribution of lifetime resources, or the parents' rank in the distribution of net wealth. And we can see that lifetime resources is kind of explaining more. When we put in, this is just kind of 100 dummy variables for the rank to see if there are non-linearities, and things really don't change very much. When we add in labor income actually does really well. And it's not totally surprising, since for most people, most of their income is actually coming from labor income. And then what we did was just do a horse race where we put in both lifetime resources and net wealth. And not surprisingly, lifetime resources is doing a lot more, and net wealth is doing less. When we put in labor income, lifetime resources goes down. Labor income seems pretty important. Lifetime resources would be second, and then net wealth would be third. And so it kind of suggests that the labor income or lifetime resources might be a better measure for kids. And so just to give you some future directions, we think this would be really interesting to do it from a non-Norwegian country, but it's hard to get data. And also doing more on like the effect of wealth on children, which is what we're really interested in, and like thinking about this kind of intergenerational aspect of our data. And so to just conclude, we think that kind of thinking about lifetime resources is kind of an interesting and possibly important measure when thinking about wealth or wealth inequality. We find that inheritance and gifts aren't a very important part of lifetime resources. Labor income is much more important, and it seems like lifetime resources are a better predictor of children's outcomes than net wealth. And that's it.
Very interesting.
Thank
So
you.
now